Here's the script for section 1 of the story. The air in Diane's office felt heavier than usual. She sat at her desk, flipping through the latest updates on the hospital's financials, the glow of her computer screen casting shadows on her face. For weeks, the news of a mysterious tech billionaire buying out the hospital had dominated every conversation in the break rooms and hallways. Staff whispered about drastic changes, layoffs, and new protocols. Diane, however, was preoccupied with a more personal fear, losing control over the institution she had poured her heart into for the last decade. Her office door was shut, but she could still hear fragments of conversations outside. Rumors. Speculations. One name kept circulating: Elon Musk. The man didn't make official announcements. He moved in silence, leaving everyone guessing about his next steps. Diane clicked through yet another article, a speculative piece on Musk's intentions with healthcare. She frowned. None of it made sense. What would a billionaire with rockets and electric cars want with a mid-sized hospital in a suburban city? Her anxiety spiked when she saw an email marked "Urgent" from the hospital board. The subject line simply read, "Acquisition finalized. Immediate implementation of new protocols." Diane scanned the email, her pulse quickening. The changes were vague but disruptive. A sudden freeze on all new hires, a reallocation of departmental budgets, and an unspecified review process for existing management. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed her coffee mug on the desk. She had survived upheavals before, but this felt different. There was no communication, no clarity, only the creeping sensation that everything she had worked for was at risk. Later that morning, Diane found herself pacing the lobby, her eyes scanning every corner of the bustling hospital. She was looking for something, or someone. For weeks, the idea of spies had lingered in the back of her mind. She had overheard staff speculating that Musk might send people undercover to observe operations. At first, she dismissed the idea as paranoia, but as the days passed, she couldn't shake the thought. If Musk wanted to clean house, wouldn't he want first-hand evidence? Her gaze landed on a man standing by the reception desk. He looked out of place, wearing a rumpled blazer and a bright red MAGA hat. The hat caught her attention immediately, its bold slogan glaring in stark contrast to the neutral tones of the hospital's decor. He was gesturing toward the receptionist, who seemed flustered, her polite demeanor faltering. Diane's stomach knotted. Something about him felt off, not just the hat, but his presence. He wasn't a patient, and he didn't have the hurried look of a visiting family member. She approached the desk with quick, deliberate steps. "Can I help you?" Diane asked, her tone sharp enough to make the man turn toward her. His expression was calm, almost amused, but Diane didn't like the way he looked at her, like he was analyzing her, sizing her up. "I was just asking about the facility," the man said casually. His voice was calm, but it didn't soothe her unease. "It's a remarkable place you've got here." "We're very busy," Diane replied curtly. "If you don't have an appointment or a valid reason to be here, I'll have to ask you to leave." The man raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into a faint smile. "No need to be so formal. I'm just observing." That did it. Diane felt her temper flare, the weeks of stress and speculation bubbling to the surface. Observing? Who was this man, and why was he so comfortable in her hospital? She motioned to the security guard stationed by the door. "Please escort this gentleman out of the building," she said firmly. The man didn't resist. He glanced at the guard, then back at Diane, his smile lingering. "You'll regret this," he said softly, almost like a promise. Then he turned and walked out, the red hat bobbing with each step. Diane stood frozen for a moment, her pulse racing. She had dealt with unruly visitors before, but this felt different. Something about the man's demeanor unnerved her, as though he knew something she didn't. She brushed off the thought and turned back to the receptionist. "Let me know if he comes back," Diane said, her voice more controlled now. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork, but the incident lingered in Diane's mind. She found herself replaying the moment over and over, questioning her reaction. Had she overreacted? Or had her instincts been right? By the time she returned to her office that evening, she was exhausted but still unsettled. She sat at her desk, staring at the framed photo of her late father, a surgeon who had inspired her to enter healthcare. "Stay strong," she whispered to herself, echoing the words he used to say when she doubted herself. But the pit in her stomach remained, and the man's parting words echoed in her mind. "You'll regret this." The boardroom was suffocatingly silent, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Diane sat at the far end of the long table, surrounded by executives and department heads. The meeting had been called on short notice, and she barely had time to prepare. The tension in the room felt electric, everyone waiting for the screen at the head of the table to flicker to life. Then it happened. The image of Elon Musk appeared on the monitor. Diane's heart sank. It was him, the man she had ordered out of the hospital lobby just hours before. He was wearing the same blazer, though the MAGA hat was gone, replaced by a calm, disarming expression that betrayed nothing. For a moment, Diane couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, trying to process what this meant. "Good afternoon," Musk began, his tone casual but commanding. "I've reviewed the initial reports from the acquisition. There's work to do, but I see potential here." His eyes scanned the room, or at least it felt that way. When his gaze seemed to linger on Diane, her stomach twisted. She couldn't tell if it was intentional or her own paranoia, but she felt exposed, like her earlier actions had already been reported. He continued speaking, outlining his vision for the hospital. It was ambitious, almost overwhelming. Cutting-edge technology, streamlined operations, a complete overhaul of the existing management systems. Musk spoke in abstract terms, leaving room for interpretation but offering no specifics. Diane scribbled notes furiously, though she felt as if none of it would make sense later. The real bombshell came toward the end of the meeting. "I'll be conducting direct reviews of all leadership positions," Musk said, "starting immediately. No exceptions." The words felt like a spotlight turning directly onto Diane. Her palms grew clammy as she tried to keep her expression neutral. Was this a coincidence, or had he targeted her specifically after their earlier encounter? After the call ended, the room buzzed with hushed conversations. Diane stayed silent, her mind clouded with questions. As the others filed out, she lingered, staring at the now blank screen. She felt a mix of dread and anger. How had she been so blind? How could she not have recognized him? The next day, changes began to roll out almost instantly. Musk's orders were swift and often baffling. Department budgets were frozen, and new metrics for performance reviews appeared in her inbox, seemingly out of nowhere. Staff members looked to Diane for guidance, but she had no answers. She couldn't admit how out of the loop she felt. The weight of her authority, once a source of pride, now felt like a noose tightening around her neck. An email arrived late in the afternoon, its subject line simple: "Leadership audit." Diane hesitated before opening it. The contents were brief: a scheduled one-on-one meeting with Musk the following week. Her chest tightened as she stared at the words, her mind racing through every decision she had made in the past month. What would he ask? What would he find? Over the next few days, Diane began noticing subtle shifts in the hospital's atmosphere. Staff seemed unusually tense, whispering in corners, their conversations cutting off whenever she approached. Equipment malfunctions became oddly frequent, and complaints from patients began trickling in more than usual. At first, she chalked it up to coincidence, the natural chaos of running a busy hospital. But as the incidents piled up, a pattern emerged. It felt orchestrated, as if someone were pulling strings behind the scenes to test her limits. Her paranoia deepened when she received an anonymous note slipped under her office door. "How you lead determines what survives," it read. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and there was no indication of who had sent it. Diane clenched the note in her hand, anger and fear boiling inside her. Was this Musk's way of toying with her? Or was someone else trying to undermine her? By the time the day of the meeting arrived, Diane was a bundle of nerves. She barely slept the night before, replaying every interaction, every decision, every word she had spoken since the acquisition. When she finally stepped into the small conference room where the meeting was to take place, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Musk was already there, seated casually at the table, a tablet in hand. He looked up as she entered, offering a polite nod. "Diane," he said, his voice calm but unreadable. "Have a seat." She obeyed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. The conversation began innocuously enough. Questions about the hospital's operations, her vision for its future, and the challenges she faced. But as the minutes ticked by, Musk's questions became more probing, more pointed. He asked about specific decisions she had made, moments she hadn't thought anyone else had noticed. Each question felt like a small chisel, chipping away at her confidence. By the end of the meeting, Diane felt drained, her composure barely intact. Musk stood, offering his hand. "You've got potential," he said, his tone almost encouraging. "But potential only matters if you rise to meet it." With that, he left, leaving Diane alone with her thoughts and a gnawing sense of inadequacy. She returned to her office, sinking into her chair as the weight of the past week crashed over her. The man she had underestimated, the man she had dismissed without a second thought, now held her career in his hands. And worse, she had no idea what he truly wanted or how far he was willing to go to get it. Over the following days, the hospital seemed to transform into a pressure cooker. Every decision Diane made felt scrutinized. Every step she took seemed observed. The staff, once a close-knit team under her leadership, grew distant. Whispers floated around her, as though carried by the sterile air. She caught fragments of conversations, mentions of Musk, of changes, of uncertainty. It was clear that the trust she had worked so hard to build was eroding. One evening, as Diane sifted through her inbox, she came across an unexpected message. It was from a staff nurse, Maria, who had worked in the hospital for over 15 years. The subject line read, "Urgent concerns." Diane hesitated before opening it, dreading yet another issue to add to her growing list of problems. The email detailed strange occurrences on the floors, equipment being moved without explanation, patient files being accessed by unauthorized personnel, and odd, unannounced visits by individuals claiming to be part of the hospital's new operational review team. Maria concluded the email with a plea for Diane to address the staff's growing fears before the situation spiraled out of control. Diane's chest tightened. It wasn't just her who felt the unease. Something bigger was happening. But was it all Musk's doing, or was there another force at play? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being tested, not just as a manager, but as a leader. The weight of it all bore down on her, but she resolved to confront these concerns directly. The next morning, she called an emergency meeting with her department heads. The conference room was packed, the air thick with tension. Diane stood at the head of the table, trying to project confidence despite the storm brewing inside her. "I know you all have questions," she began, her voice steady but firm. "And I know you're feeling the effects of the changes happening around us. But I need to make one thing clear. This hospital is still about the people we serve. That hasn't changed." Her words hung in the air, but the response was lukewarm at best. Some nodded, others avoided her gaze. One department head, a seasoned surgeon named Dr. Patel, spoke up. With all due respect, Diane, the staff is losing faith. They're scared. We don't know what Musk's endgame is, and frankly, we don't know if you're on the same page as us anymore. The remark hit Diane like a punch to the gut, but she maintained her composure. I understand your frustration, she replied, but we need to focus on what we can control. I promise you, I will get to the bottom of this. But I need your trust to do that. After the meeting, Diane returned to her office, her confidence shaken. She stared at the anonymous note she had received days earlier, still sitting on her desk. How you lead determines what survives. The words felt like a riddle, taunting her with their ambiguity. Was it a warning? A challenge? And who had written it? That evening, as Diane walked the hospital floors, she decided to do something she hadn't done in weeks. Listen. She stopped by the nurses' station, asking about their shifts. She visited the ER, checking on the staff's morale. She even ventured into the patient wings, striking up conversations with families waiting anxiously by their loved ones' bedsides. The more she listened, the clearer it became that the hospital's heart was still beating strong, despite the chaos. But as the night wore on, Diane couldn't ignore the undercurrent of fear running through everyone she spoke to. Stories of unexplained equipment failures, sudden shifts in staffing assignments, and even patients being transferred without notice painted a picture of a hospital teetering on the edge of something she couldn't fully understand. And then there were the whispers of Musk, how his presence loomed like a shadow over everything, even though he had yet to set foot in the building since the acquisition. Just as she was about to call it a night, Diane received a call from security. Ma'am, we've got a situation, the guard said. There's someone in the records room. Says he's with the new management team, but his ID doesn't check out. Diane's heart raced as she made her way to the records room. The hospital's patient files were sacred, containing sensitive information that required the utmost protection. When she arrived, the guard was waiting outside the door. He's still in there, the guard said, his tone uneasy. Taking a deep breath, Diane pushed open the door. Inside, a man stood with his back to her, rifling through a file cabinet. He turned as she entered, and Diane froze. It was the same man she had thrown out of the hospital lobby, the man in the MAGA hat. Only now, he wasn't wearing the hat, and his demeanor was far from casual. His expression was calm, almost clinical, as if he had expected her. Who are you? Diane demanded, her voice sharp. And what are you doing in here? The man smiled faintly, closing the cabinet with deliberate slowness. I'm exactly who you think I am, he said cryptically. And I'm here to make sure everything is in order. Before Diane could respond, he brushed past her, his movements fluid and unhurried. You should pay closer attention to what's happening in your hospital, Diane, he said over his shoulder. Things aren't always as they seem. And just like that, he was gone, leaving Diane standing in the records room, her mind reeling. What did he mean? And how had he gained access to one of the most secure areas in the hospital? Her thoughts spiraled, but one thing was clear: whoever this man was, he was part of something much larger than she had anticipated. And if she didn't act soon, the hospital, and everything it stood for, might slip through her fingers. The morning after the incident in the records room, Diane sat in her office, staring at the phone on her desk. Her mind was a whirlwind of unanswered questions and creeping paranoia. She had considered calling the police, but what would she even report? A strange man rifling through files who left as mysteriously as he entered? And what if Musk was behind it? Reporting it might only escalate her precarious position. Instead, she resolved to dig deeper herself. Diane spent hours combing through records of staff hires, security logs, and recent policy changes implemented under Musk's management. But every trail seemed to lead to a dead end. The new hires were all vetted by an external agency Musk had brought in, and the security footage from the records room had somehow gone missing. It was as though the hospital had become a stage for an unseen player pulling strings behind the scenes. Later that day, Diane received another email, this one from Musk's assistant, inviting her to a private strategy session the following week. The timing was uncanny, and it felt more like a summons than an invitation. She couldn't shake the feeling that Musk was aware of every move she was making. Was this a test? A trap? She didn't know, but the walls were closing in, and she needed allies. She decided to confide in Maria, the veteran nurse, who had sent the initial email about strange occurrences. They met after hours in the staff lounge, the room dimly lit to avoid drawing attention. Diane outlined everything: the man in the records room, the anonymous note, the missing security footage. As she spoke, Maria's expression shifted from concern to determination. "You're not imagining this," Maria said firmly. "There's been too much happening for it to be a coincidence. Equipment failures, strange audits, sudden transfers, it's all connected. Musk or not, someone is orchestrating this." Their conversation was interrupted by a faint sound outside the door. Diane froze, her heart pounding. Maria gestured for silence as they listened intently. Footsteps. Someone was nearby, lingering just outside. Diane's mind raced. Had they been followed? She gestured to Maria to stay put and cautiously opened the door, only to find an empty hallway. The unease in her chest grew heavier. The next day, Diane's resolve hardened. If she was going to protect the hospital and the people in it, she couldn't wait for answers to come to her. She began conducting discreet one-on-one conversations with staff members she trusted, piecing together a pattern of inconsistencies. Doctors reported sudden changes in protocols without explanation, nurses mentioned seeing unfamiliar faces in restricted areas, and patients spoke of being questioned by individuals who weren't part of the medical team. One name kept coming up: Alex, a junior administrator who had been recently hired as part of Musk's operational overhaul. Alex had been present during several of the incidents Diane was investigating, and his role seemed deliberately ambiguous. When she finally confronted him in his office, Alex's demeanor was unerringly calm, almost smug. "I'm just doing my job," he said when Diane pressed him on his actions. "The new management has high expectations, and we're all being evaluated, including you." Diane's frustration boiled over. "Evaluated for what? And by whom? This isn't some corporate experiment. This is a hospital. People's lives are at stake." Alex didn't answer. Instead, he gave her a knowing smile that sent a chill down her spine. "You'll find out soon enough." That night, Diane couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were consumed by Alex's cryptic words and the looming meeting with Musk. She felt like a pawn in a game she didn't understand, with no way to see the full board. But she also knew that staying passive wasn't an option. If Musk or anyone else thought they could manipulate her, they were sorely mistaken. By morning, Diane had a plan. She enlisted Maria and a small group of trusted staff members to help her gather evidence. They began documenting every irregularity, from unexplained patient transfers to unauthorized access logs. Diane also reached out to a contact at a local news outlet, someone she trusted to handle the information carefully if it came to that. She wasn't ready to go public, but having a contingency plan eased some of her anxiety. The following days were a blur of covert operations. Diane felt like a detective in her own hospital, piecing together a puzzle that only seemed to grow more complex. Her team discovered that some of the new hires had connections to Musk's other ventures, raising questions about their true purpose at the hospital. They also uncovered discrepancies in financial records, funds allocated to operational improvements that didn't align with any visible changes. Just when Diane thought they were making progress, she received another note. This one was taped to her car windshield when she left work late one evening. It read, You're getting closer, but are you ready for the truth? The handwriting was the same as the first note, and the message sent a shiver down her spine. Diane clutched the note tightly, her mind racing. Whoever was behind this wanted her to keep digging, but why? Was it a warning or an invitation? And what truth were they referring to? She didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. The hospital wasn't just a place of healing anymore. It had become a battlefield. And if Diane was going to survive, she needed to uncover the truth before it was too late. Certainly. Here's an act focused on keeping the narrative concise, impactful, and to the point. The city buzzed with energy, a constant hum that resonated from every corner. The people moved through their routines, never pausing, never questioning. But there were always those few who couldn't silence the doubts, those who felt the weight of something more, a looming decision that would redefine their existence. On the surface, everything appeared perfect. The streets were clean, the buildings tall, and the skies were free of clouds. Yet, underneath, there was a growing restlessness, a quiet discontent simmering beneath the polished exterior. People went about their daily lives, but it was as if something intangible, was slipping away from them. They were being shaped by an invisible force, their choices less their own and more a response to an unseen influence. Among them was a man, once vibrant with passion, now numb from the repetitive monotony of life. His eyes reflected the weariness of years spent chasing hollow ambitions. He had once believed in the pursuit of greatness, in carving out a legacy that would last beyond his time. But now, as he stood on the precipice of a decision that could change everything, he wondered whether it was all worth it. He could feel the tug of two opposing forces within him, the desire for safety, for comfort, and the yearning for something real, something that wasn't just an illusion of success. The world around him didn't seem to care about his internal battle. The pulse of the city continued, indifferent to the individual's struggles. People talked, laughed, worked, and lived without even acknowledging the growing uncertainty in the air. The system they existed within was flawless in its execution, driving them forward without pause or compassion. Yet, for some reason, this man couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the crossroads of a monumental choice, one that would either free him or trap him forever. Every moment of indecision felt like it was pulling him deeper into a void. He'd seen others in his position, their faces etched with the same quiet desperation, their eyes devoid of hope. He had always vowed not to become one of them, but here he was, unsure, lost, and unsure if he even wanted to find his way. The time came, as it always does, when the choice had to be made. He stood at the threshold, staring down the path that would either lead him into the unknown or keep him in the comfort of what he knew. His heart raced, his mind screamed for answers, but there were none. All he had was the instinct that had carried him this far, the same instinct that had made him question everything in the first place. But then, as the weight of the decision pressed against him, he realized that no matter which direction he chose, the city would keep spinning, the people would keep living, and the world would continue on its endless journey. His life, his actions, might not matter in the grand scheme of things. But it was in those small moments of choice, of defiance, that he found meaning. It wasn't about the outcome, it was about the courage to make the choice in the first place. He walked forward, not knowing where the road would lead. There was no clear path, no guiding light, but the air felt different now. It was heavy with possibility, as though the world had momentarily paused, waiting for him to decide what came next. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope, however fleeting. In the distance, the skyline still stood tall, unwavering, a symbol of everything that had been built. But closer to him, in the quiet corners of his mind, there was something else, a spark of something real, something that could never be touched or quantified, but that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to rise. And so, he stepped forward, the future uncertain, but his resolve stronger than ever. It didn't matter what awaited him. What mattered was the choice he had made, the commitment to walk his own path, to define his own destiny. He didn't need the approval of the city, or the world, or anyone. This moment, this decision, was his own. Certainly, here is the script as requested. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the world itself held its breath. The decisions that had been made, the ones that had shaped the lives of those involved, had brought them to this singular moment. Everything hinged on it, but no one was sure what would come next. The path ahead was a mystery, a dark corridor where nothing was certain. The consequences of their actions had been set in motion, and now it was time to face them. For some, the choice had been clear, a simple step forward into the unknown. For others, it was a battle, a fight with every ounce of their being to cling to what they knew, to hold on to the comfort of familiarity. But in the end, there was no escaping the inevitable. The moment had arrived, and it was too late to turn back. The eyes of the world seemed to narrow on them, 1,000 unseen forces watching with silent judgment. Every move they made, every breath they took, felt like a statement, a reflection of everything they had come to stand for, or perhaps, everything they had failed to become. There was no room for hesitation, no space for doubt. Time had a way of stripping away the luxury of second chances. And so they moved, step by step, each one weighed down by the gravity of the situation. The silence around them was deafening, each footfall louder than the last, echoing through the corridors of their minds. Their hearts pounded, faster with every passing moment. The pressure mounted, a crushing weight that threatened to consume them whole. There was no manual for this, no guide to show them the way. They could only rely on what they had learned, the instincts they had honed over years of living, of surviving. The unknown was daunting, but they had no choice but to face it head-on. There was no more waiting, no more preparing. The moment to act had arrived, and it was now or never. Each of them had their own reasons for being here, for reaching this point. Some sought redemption, a way to make amends for past mistakes. Others were driven by a need to prove themselves, to show the world that they were capable of more than they had been given credit for. And there were those who simply wanted to escape, to run away from a life that no longer fit them, a life they no longer recognized. But despite their different motivations, they were all here for one reason, to face the unknown. The choice that lay before them was not one of comfort, but one of necessity. To step forward was to embrace the uncertainty, to trust that something better could be waiting just beyond the horizon. To stay where they were, to turn back, was to resign themselves to the life they had outgrown, the one that had trapped them in its confines. The clock ticked away in the background, a constant reminder that time was slipping through their fingers. They could feel it, like sand running out of an hourglass. And yet, despite the urgency, there was a strange sense of calm within them. It wasn't peace, but something close, acceptance of what was coming, a realization that they no longer had the power to control the outcome. Their choices had been made, their fates intertwined with the choices of others. It was a web of actions and reactions, each one a thread that connected them to something larger, something they couldn't quite grasp. But there was no time to dwell on that now. The moment had passed for questioning, for wondering what could have been different. Now, it was about moving forward, about taking that first step into the unknown and seeing where it led. There was no guarantee of success, no promise that everything would fall into place as they hoped. But there was something more important than certainty, the courage to move without it, the courage to face the darkness, to embrace the uncertainty, and to trust in their ability to navigate whatever came next. It was this courage, this unwavering belief in their own strength, that would carry them through. They didn't need to know the outcome. They didn't need to see the end before they began. All they needed was the willingness to act, to trust themselves in the face of the unknown. The world around them remained silent, as if waiting for them to make their move. They had no idea how long they had before the doors closed, before the finality of the moment set in. But they knew one thing for certain: once they stepped forward, there would be no going back. And so they did. Each of them, in their own way, took that step into the unknown, leaving behind the safety of the familiar and embracing the possibility of something new. There were no guarantees, no promises of success or failure. But there was a sense of freedom in that moment, a feeling that they were finally taking control of their own destinies, that they were no longer bound by the past. The weight that had burdened them for so long lifted, if only for a brief moment, as they moved forward into the future. The uncertainty, the fear, the doubt, it was all still there, but it no longer held them back. It no longer had the power to define them. In the end, the choice wasn't about what they would find on the other side. It was about who they would become in the process. And with that realization, they stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the act of choosing had already changed them forever. The world outside felt like a distant hum, muffled by the weight of the moment. Every action, every decision, seemed to reverberate in the air, making it impossible to ignore the consequences that would follow. There was no escaping it now. The path had been chosen, and the future lay ahead, but the uncertainty of what that future would bring gnawed at their minds. Each breath felt like a reminder of the stakes at play. What was done could not be undone. There was no going back. The past, though still present in their minds, had been left behind, swallowed by the relentless march of time. All that mattered was the here and now, the steps they were about to take, and the unknown that stretched endlessly before them. The pressure was suffocating, a constant weight that seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. There was no easy way out, no simple solution to the puzzle they now faced. Yet, they moved forward, driven by something deep inside them, something that refused to let them succumb to fear or hesitation. They had come too far to stop now, and despite the overwhelming doubt that clouded their minds, there was a flicker of something else, a spark of resolve. It was easy to become consumed by the enormity of it all, to let the magnitude of the decision cloud their judgment. But in that moment, clarity emerged from the chaos. It wasn't about what might happen in the future. It wasn't about the possible outcomes or the risks involved. It was about action, about doing something, anything, in the face of uncertainty. The future would unfold regardless of their choices. But they would be the ones who shaped their path forward. The clock continued to tick, indifferent to the emotions that twisted inside them. It had become a cruel reminder of how little time they had left to make a difference. But with that understanding came a sense of freedom. Time might be running out, but they had control over how they spent it. They could decide how to use the fleeting moments they had. It wasn't the fear of failure that held them back. It was the fear of not trying, of letting this moment slip through their fingers without so much as a fight. The thought of letting go of the chance, of walking away from the unknown, was unbearable. If they didn't act now, if they didn't take a stand, they would forever wonder what could have been. And that was the one thing they could not bear, to live with the regret of never knowing. But with the desire to act came the inevitable weight of doubt. The fear that they might not be enough, that they might not have what it took to see it through. It was a natural reaction, a reflection of the stakes that had been placed before them. But they couldn't afford to listen to it. The doubts would always be there, lurking in the background, but they could not allow them to take control. They had to push forward, even in the face of their own insecurities. They had faced challenges before, each one different, each one demanding something new. And each time, they had risen to meet it. This was no different. It was just another test, another obstacle that, in time, would become part of their story. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, it would fade into the background, and they would move forward, stronger for having faced it. In that moment, they realized that the key to overcoming the pressure wasn't to wait for the fear to disappear. It was to act in spite of it, to acknowledge the uncertainty and the doubt, but not let them define the choices that lay ahead. The fear didn't disappear, but it lost its power when they stopped allowing it to control them. And so, they made the choice. It wasn't a perfect decision. There were still questions, still unanswered doubts. But it was a choice nonetheless. And that choice, that act of determination, would carry them through whatever came next. The road ahead was unclear, but they were no longer afraid to walk it. They had embraced the uncertainty, the chaos, and had chosen to move forward with it. There would be challenges, there would be moments of doubt, but they were no longer the same person who had stood on the edge of indecision. The act of choosing, of stepping forward, had changed them in ways they could not yet fully understand. It had given them the strength to face whatever came next. The fear would come, but they knew how to handle it now. They knew that the only way to survive was to keep moving, to keep making choices, even in the face of the unknown. The world might not have changed, and the future was still uncertain. But they had changed. And that was all that mattered. The rest would unfold in its own time. They would continue, step by step, until they reached whatever end awaited them. But for now, they had taken control of their destiny. For now, they had chosen to act, to face the unknown, and to trust that the future would be shaped by the choices they made today. In the end, the only thing that mattered was the courage to keep moving forward, to refuse to be paralyzed by the fear of the unknown. That was the true power they had found within themselves. And with it, they would face whatever lay ahead, knowing that the act of moving forward, no matter how small, was the key to unlocking their future,